The year was 1857, when the first reports surfaced about a man who would become known simply as Elias. Not Elias the field hand, not Elias of Whitmore Plantation, just Elias. The name itself became enough to silence conversations in the drawing rooms of antebellum Georgia. What happened during those 3 months in the summer of 1857 would leave scars across Bibb County that some say never fully healed. According to county records archived in the basement of the Macon Courthouse, Elias Benjamin Cartwright was born in 1822 on the Whitmore Plantation, situated along the banks of the Ocmulgee River. The plantation sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of fertile bottomland, producing cotton that found its way to mills in Savannah and beyond. The Overseer's Journal, discovered in 1962 during renovations of the main house, describes Elias as exceptionally tall for his time, standing well over 6 feet, with hands that could span the width of a cotton bale. The Whitmore family had owned the plantation for 3 generations. Colonel Marcus Whitmore inherited the property from his father in 1845, along with 47 enslaved individuals whose names were recorded in a leather-bound ledger that survived the events that followed. Elias appeared on page 12 of this ledger, valued at $800, alongside a notation that he could read, an unusual skill that would later prove significant. Life on the Whitmore Plantation followed patterns established long before Elias was born. The overseer, a man named Jonathan Birch, maintained order through a system of rewards and punishments documented in his daily reports. These reports, found stuffed behind loose boards in what remained of the overseer's quarters, paint a picture of routine brutality that was considered standard practice. Birch noted that Elias rarely required correction, describing him as intelligent and cooperative, though he mentioned an unsettling quality about the man's silence. The summer heat of 1857 proved particularly oppressive. Temperatures soared above 90 degrees for weeks without relief, and the cotton plants withered in fields that had previously yielded record harvests. It was during this period that several plantation records mention an unusual discovery. While clearing deadfall from a section of woods near the river, workers uncovered what appeared to be the remains of an old structure, perhaps a cabin or small dwelling that predated the plantation itself. Among the debris, according to a letter written by Colonel Whitmore to his brother in Savannah, they found items that seemed out of place, iron implements that served no clear agricultural purpose, pieces of chain that appeared to have been deliberately broken, and most disturbing, human remains that suggested the presence of people who had never been recorded in any official capacity. The letter, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, indicates that Colonel Whitmore ordered the area sealed and forbidden to all plantation workers. But Elias had seen what lay beneath the collapsed timbers. According to testimony given years later by Margaret Hastings, a woman who had worked in the Whitmore house since childhood, Elias began asking questions that made the White family uncomfortable. He wanted to know about the previous owners of the land, about records that might exist from earlier times, about the names of people who might have lived and died on the property before the Whitmores claimed it. The overseer's journal entries from this period become increasingly terse. Where Birch had previously recorded detailed accounts of daily activities, his writing turned sparse and focused mainly on productivity numbers. A notation from early July mentions that Elias had been found in areas of the plantation where he had no assigned duties, though no punishment was recorded. Another entry, barely legible due to what appears to be water damage, suggests that other workers had begun avoiding Elias, though Birch provides no explanation for this behavior. Margaret Hastings would later tell investigators that the change in Elias became noticeable around the middle of July. She described him as withdrawn, but not sullen, quiet, but not submissive. Most unsettling, she said, was his habit of staring at the main house during evening hours, not with anger or resentment, but with what she could only describe as calculation. When questioned about specific incidents, Hastings mentioned that Elias had begun asking her about her family, about her parents and grandparents, about how long they had lived on the plantation. The first unusual incident occurred on July 23rd, 1857. According to multiple accounts, including a report filed with the Bibb County Sheriff's Office, sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood were heard from the direction of the old slave quarters during the pre-dawn hours. When Overseer Birch investigated, he found that several windows had been shattered from the inside, and furniture had been overturned in what appeared to be a systematic fashion. No one claimed responsibility for the damage, and no obvious motivation could be determined. More troubling was what Birch found in Elias's quarters. The small cabin that housed 4 men showed signs of disturbance, but only in the area where Elias slept. His meager possessions had been arranged in patterns that Birch described as ritualistic, though he admitted he could not explain what he meant by this description. Scraps of paper covered with writing were scattered across Elias's sleeping area, though Birch noted that he could not read the handwriting and was uncertain whether the markings constituted actual words. Colonel Whitmore's correspondence from this period reveals growing concern about conditions on the plantation. In a letter dated July 28th to his factor in Savannah, Whitmore mentions productivity decreases and an atmosphere of unease among both enslaved and free workers. He attributes these problems to the oppressive heat, but acknowledges that traditional methods of maintaining order seemed less effective than usual. The letter suggests that Whitmore was considering selling several workers, though he does not specify which individuals he had in mind. The discovery that would change everything happened on August 2nd, 1857. A group of workers preparing a section of bottomland for late-season planting uncovered what county records describe as a collection of personal effects buried approximately 3 feet beneath the surface. The items included clothing, tools, and most significantly, documents that appeared to be official papers related to land ownership and slave trading from the 1820s and 30s. Among these papers, according to a detailed inventory prepared by the county clerk, were bills of sale that listed individuals by name, age, and monetary value. Several names on these documents matched entries in the current plantation ledger, suggesting that some of the people who had lived and worked on the property during earlier ownership periods were parents or grandparents of current residents. More disturbing were documents that indicated several people recorded as sold had never actually left the plantation, raising questions about their ultimate fate. Elias was present when these documents were discovered. Margaret Hastings later testified that he was allowed to examine the papers because of his ability to read, and that he spent considerable time studying what appeared to be a particular set of documents. She could not say what information these papers contained, but she noted that Elias's demeanor changed markedly after this examination. Where he had previously been quiet and watchful, he became what she described as frighteningly calm. The overseer's journal entry for August 2nd is longer than any previous entry that summer. Birch writes that the discovery of the buried documents created significant disruption among the plantation's enslaved population. Several individuals became agitated upon learning that papers from earlier periods had been found, though Birch does not specify what information caused this reaction. He notes that Elias volunteered to help interpret the documents, an offer that was initially accepted but later rescinded when Colonel Whitmore decided the papers should be examined only by white officials. However, A letter from Colonel Whitmore to his brother suggests that the damage had already been done. Whitmore writes that Elias had managed to read enough of the documents to understand their implications, and that this knowledge had somehow spread among other workers, despite efforts to maintain secrecy. The letter indicates that Whitmore was considering drastic measures to restore order, though he does not elaborate on what these measures might involve. The first fire occurred on the night of August 7th, 1857. According to witness testimony recorded by county officials, flames were first observed around midnight, emanating from a storage building that housed cotton processing equipment. The structure burned completely before any firefighting efforts could be organized, though the blaze did not spread to adjacent buildings. Investigation of the scene revealed that the fire had been deliberately set, using what appeared to be lamp oil and cotton fibers, arranged in a pattern that ensured rapid and complete combustion. No one claimed to have seen who started the fire, though several witnesses mentioned observing a tall figure moving through the area shortly before the flames were discovered. When questioned the following morning, Elias was found in his quarters, apparently asleep, though Overseer Birch noted that his clothing showed no signs of soot or smoke, despite the fact that all other residents of the quarters had been awakened by the commotion and had attempted to help fight the fire. Colonel Whitmore's immediate response was to implement what he termed enhanced security measures. Additional overseers were hired from neighboring plantations, and a system of regular nighttime patrols was established. Workers were forbidden from moving between buildings after sunset without explicit permission, and any gathering of more than 3 individuals required supervision. These measures, documented in county records as necessary for maintaining order, created an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance that affected every aspect of plantation life. The second fire occurred 12 days later, on August 19th. This time, the target was the plantation's smithy, a building that contained not only metalworking tools, but also the heavy chains and restraints used to control enslaved workers. The fire burned with unusual intensity, suggesting that accelerants had been used, and the heat was sufficient to warp iron tools and melt brass fittings. Most significantly, the specialized manacles and leg irons stored in the building were destroyed beyond any possibility of repair or reuse. Witnesses to this fire provided more detailed accounts. Samuel Crawford, an enslaved man who worked as a carpenter, testified that he had observed someone moving deliberately through the smithy area approximately 1 hour before the flames appeared. Crawford described seeing this figure examining the building's contents by lamplight, paying particular attention to the restraints and chains. When asked if he could identify the individual, Crawford stated that the person was tall and moved with familiarity through the space, but claimed he could not see the person's face clearly enough to provide positive identification. The destruction of the restraints created immediate practical problems for plantation management. Without the ability to physically restrain workers who violated rules or attempted to escape, Colonel Whitmore found himself dependent on cooperation that could no longer be enforced through traditional means. Letters from this period reveal his growing frustration with what he perceived as a breakdown in the natural order that had previously governed plantation life. More troubling were reports of conversations taking place among enslaved workers that touched on subjects previously considered dangerous to discuss. Margaret Hastings testified that she overheard planning sessions in which individuals debated the possibility of leaving the plantation without permission, discussions that would have been unthinkable before the fires began. The destruction of the restraints had created a psychological shift that extended far beyond the practical implications of the missing equipment. Elias continued to maintain his routine during this period, though observers noted changes in his behavior that suggested careful preparation for some future action. The overseer's journal mentions that Elias had begun declining the small privileges sometimes extended to trusted workers, such as additional food rations or permission to visit other plantations. Instead, he appeared focused on activities that served no obvious purpose, such as studying the layout of buildings and noting the timing of patrol schedules. The third and most devastating fire occurred on the night of September 1st, 1857. The target was the main plantation house itself, a structure that had stood since 1815 and contained not only the Whitmore family's living quarters, but also the office where plantation records, correspondence, and financial documents were stored. The fire began in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting coordination and advanced planning that exceeded anything seen in the previous incidents. Colonel Whitmore and his family escaped the blaze, but the house burned to its foundation, taking with it decades of records that documented the plantation's operations and the lives of everyone who had lived and worked on the property. The loss of these documents meant that evidence of land ownership, financial transactions, and personal histories was destroyed, creating a void that would complicate any future legal or historical investigation of events at the plantation. Witnesses described seeing a figure standing at the edge of the tree line while the house burned, apparently observing the destruction without attempting to help or flee. Multiple individuals identified this figure as Elias, though when authorities searched for him the following morning, they found his quarters empty. The other residents of his cabin claimed to have no knowledge of his whereabouts, and a search of the plantation grounds revealed no trace of where he might have gone. Among the few items recovered from the burned house was a partially destroyed letter that Colonel Whitmore had apparently been writing to his brother. The surviving fragments, preserved in county archives, include references to the discovered documents and suggestions that the fires were connected to information revealed in those papers. The letter mentions specific names and dates, though most of this information was too damaged by fire and water to be clearly legible. The investigation that followed focused initially on recapturing Elias and determining his role in the fires. County authorities organized search parties that covered the surrounding countryside, but no trace of him was found, despite rewards offered for information leading to his capture. Neighboring plantations were alerted to watch for a man matching his description, but no reliable sightings were reported during the weeks immediately following his disappearance. More puzzling were reports that began filtering in from other areas of Georgia during the autumn of 1857. Several plantations in counties as far away as Burke and Jefferson reported incidents of fire, theft, or unexplained damage to property during the months following the destruction at Whitmore Plantation. While no direct connection could be proven, the pattern of incidents suggested the work of someone with detailed knowledge of plantation operations and the ability to move undetected across considerable distances. Of particular interest to investigators was information provided by Margaret Hastings during extended questioning about the period leading up to the fires. Hastings revealed that Elias had asked detailed questions about other plantations in the region, particularly those that had been established during the same time period as Whitmore Plantation. He had seemed especially interested in properties that might contain burial grounds or other evidence of earlier occupants who were not reflected in official records. The documents that had been discovered in August and subsequently lost in the fire of the main house became the subject of considerable speculation. County officials attempted to reconstruct their contents based on witness testimony, but the accounts were fragmentary and often contradictory. What seemed clear was that the papers had contained information about the fate of individuals who had been recorded as sold, but who might never have actually left the property where they had lived and died. A partial inventory prepared by the county clerk before the destruction of the main house suggests that the documents included correspondence between slave traders that detailed practices considered questionable even by the standards of the time. References were made to sales that existed only on paper, to individuals who were listed as transferred, but who were never actually moved from their original locations. The implications of these arrangements, if accurately documented, would have called into question the legal basis for ownership of both land and people across multiple properties in central Georgia. The investigation officially concluded in December 1857, when county authorities declared that insufficient evidence existed to pursue criminal charges related to the fires. This conclusion was reached despite the testimony of multiple witnesses and the obvious pattern of deliberate destruction that had occurred over the course of nearly a month. The decision to close the case was influenced by practical considerations, including the difficulty of locating the primary suspect and the destruction of most physical evidence in the fire that consumed the main house. Colonel Whitmore attempted to rebuild his operations on a reduced scale, but the combination of financial losses from the fires and the disruption to his workforce made this effort unsuccessful. In 1858, he sold what remained of the plantation to a consortium of investors from Savannah and relocated his family to South Carolina. The new owners attempted to restore productivity, but they found that many of the enslaved workers who had not fled during the chaos of the previous year were unwilling or unable to return to previous levels of efficiency. The property changed hands several more times during the 1860s and 70s, but none of the subsequent owners achieved the level of productivity that had characterized the plantation during its earlier periods. Local residents attributed this decline to various factors, including soil depletion and economic disruption caused by the Civil War, but some maintained that the events of 1857 had left a permanent mark on the land that made normal agricultural operations impossible. During the 1890s, when the property was being surveyed for possible sale to a timber company, workers discovered additional evidence of the earlier burial sites that had first been uncovered in 1857. The remains of at least 12 individuals were found in unmarked graves scattered across several acres of what had once been considered unused woodland. The condition and positioning of these remains suggested that they represented people who had died over an extended period of time, possibly spanning several decades. More disturbing was the discovery of personal effects buried alongside these remains. Items including clothing, tools, and what appeared to be personal documents suggested that these individuals had been interred with more care and consideration than would have been typical for enslaved people during the antebellum period. The presence of these carefully preserved burial sites raised questions about who had been responsible for these interments and why they had been hidden from official knowledge. Local historians who examined the site during the 1890s noted that the positioning of the graves suggested deliberate planning and ongoing maintenance over an extended period. Someone had been tending these burial sites, adding new graves as needed and maintaining the existing ones in a manner that showed respect and remembrance. The identity of the person or persons responsible for this maintenance remained a mystery, as did the question of how such activities could have been conducted without the knowledge of successive property owners. The timber company that eventually purchased the property reported several incidents during their logging operations that workers found unsettling. Equipment was found, moved from where it had been left the previous evening. Marked trees were discovered unmarked, and tools disappeared only to reappear in locations where they had not been placed. While these incidents could be explained as pranks or theft, their consistent pattern and the apparent knowledge required to carry them out suggested the work of someone familiar with both the property and the logging operation. Workers also reported observing someone moving through the forested areas of the property during evening hours, though attempts to approach or communicate with this individual were unsuccessful. Descriptions provided by various witnesses were consistent in noting unusual height and apparent familiarity with the terrain, but no clear identification was ever achieved. The logging supervisor eventually assigned workers to patrol the property during off hours, but these patrols failed to encounter anyone who could be questioned about the mysterious activities. The logging operation ceased in 1898, when the company determined that continued incidents of sabotage and equipment problems made the project economically unviable. The property was sold again, this time to a group of investors who planned to develop it for residential use. However, these development plans were abandoned after surveyors reported discovering additional burial sites and evidence of structures that did not appear on any official maps or records of the property. By the early 1900s, the property had acquired a reputation among local residents that made it difficult to sell or develop. Stories circulated about the events of 1857 and their connection to ongoing mysterious activities on the land. While these stories varied in their details, they consistently featured references to someone who continued to live on or regularly visit the property, despite the absence of any legal residence or official permission to be there. A detailed study of the property was conducted in 1943 by researchers from the University of Georgia who were investigating historical sites related to slavery and plantation agriculture. Their work revealed the extent of the burial sites and provided the first systematic documentation of the evidence suggesting that significant events had occurred on the property that were not reflected in official historical records. The researchers' report, filed with the university but never published, concluded that the property contained evidence of activities and events that contradicted the official narrative of plantation operations during the antebellum period. The careful maintenance of burial sites, the presence of hidden structures, and the destruction of official records suggested what the researchers termed systematic resistance that had been conducted over an extended period by individuals with intimate knowledge of plantation operations and sufficient skill to avoid detection. Most significantly, the researchers found evidence that suggested ongoing habitation of the property by someone who had managed to remain undetected for decades. Temporary shelters, food storage areas, and what appeared to be carefully concealed routes through the forested sections of the property indicated the presence of someone who understood how to live off the land without attracting attention from successive property owners or local authorities. The research team attempted to locate this individual through systematic observation and by establishing a camp on the property for several weeks during the summer of 1943. They observed signs of recent activity, including evidence that someone had been monitoring their presence and movements, but they were unable to establish direct contact despite leaving messages and supplies in locations where they believed they might be found. In their final report, the researchers speculated that the individual living on the property might be connected to the events of 1857, though they acknowledged that this conclusion required accepting that someone could have survived undetected in the area for nearly 90 years. They noted that local oral traditions included stories of a tall man who appeared periodically in the region, always at sites associated with former plantations, and who seemed to possess knowledge of events and people from earlier periods. The University of Georgia research team attempted to trace these oral traditions through interviews with elderly residents of Bibb County and surrounding areas. Several individuals provided accounts that had been passed down through their families regarding encounters with someone matching the description of Elias during the decades following 1857. These accounts were remarkable for their consistency in describing an individual who appeared much younger than his chronological age would suggest, and who seemed to possess detailed knowledge of local history that exceeded what could be expected from someone who had not been formally educated. One particularly detailed account was provided by Martha Stevens, a woman born in 1875 whose grandmother had worked as a domestic servant on several plantations in the area. According to Stevens, her grandmother had encountered the mysterious individual multiple times during the 1880s and 90s, always in connection with former plantation sites that were experiencing unusual incidents or discoveries. Stevens reported that her grandmother described conversations with this individual that revealed extensive knowledge of specific families and events from the antebellum period, including details about people and incidents that were not recorded in official documents or widely known among local residents. The individual apparently possessed information about burial sites, hidden documents, and family connections that proved accurate when investigated, suggesting access to sources of knowledge that conventional historical research had not uncovered. The research conducted by the University of Georgia team was classified as sensitive material in 1944 and was not made available to other researchers or the general public. The classification was reportedly requested by federal authorities who were concerned that the report contained information that could be misinterpreted or used to promote civil unrest during the wartime period. The documents remained classified until 1967, when they were quietly transferred to the university's Special Collections Library, with restrictions on access that required approval from the administration. When the documents finally became available to researchers in the late 1960s, they revealed the extent of the evidence that had been gathered regarding ongoing activities at the former Whitmore Plantation and other related sites. The university team had documented not only the burial sites and structural remains, but also what appeared to be a systematic effort to preserve and protect historical information that had been deliberately concealed or destroyed during the antebellum period. The most significant discovery made by the research team was a collection of documents that had been cached in a waterproof container buried beneath one of the structural remains on the property. These papers included correspondence, financial records, and personal accounts that provided a detailed picture of plantation operations during the 1820s and 30s. More importantly, they contained information about resistance activities and escape networks that had operated in central Georgia during the antebellum period. Among these documents were detailed maps showing routes through swampland and forest areas that could be used to move between plantations without detection. The maps included information about safe houses, supply caches, and individuals who could be trusted to provide assistance to escaped slaves or others seeking to avoid official attention. The level of detail and the extent of the network suggested coordination between multiple plantations and involvement by both enslaved and free individuals. The documents also contained lists of names, dates, and locations that corresponded to the unmarked burial sites found on the property. These lists provided evidence that the burial sites contained the remains of individuals who had died while participating in resistance activities, including people who had been officially recorded as escaped or sold, but who had actually remained in the area to continue their work with the underground networks. Most disturbing were accounts of systematic violence directed against individuals suspected of involvement in resistance activities. The documents described incidents of torture, murder, and concealment that had been conducted by plantation owners and overseers working in cooperation with local authorities. These activities had been carefully hidden from official records and had targeted not only enslaved individuals, but also free blacks and white sympathizers who were believed to possess knowledge of escape networks. The evidence suggested that Elias had not been simply a lone individual driven to violent action by personal circumstances, but rather a participant in a complex network of resistance that had operated across multiple plantations and had possessed sophisticated knowledge of local terrain, plantation operations, and legal systems. The fires at Whitmore Plantation represented not random destruction, but a carefully planned action designed to destroy evidence of the violent suppression of resistance activities and to disrupt the operations of individuals who had participated in that suppression. The University of Georgia research team concluded their investigation with the recommendation that the site be preserved as a historical landmark, and that additional research be conducted to trace the extent of the resistance network that appeared to have operated throughout central Georgia. However, these recommendations were not implemented, and the property remained in private ownership, with access restricted to authorized researchers and officials. During the 1970s, urban development in Bibb County reached the area where the former Whitmore Plantation had operated. Plans were developed for a residential subdivision that would cover most of the historical sites, but these plans were delayed by legal challenges related to the historical significance of the property and the rights of descendants of individuals who had lived and worked there during the antebellum period. The legal proceedings revealed the extent of the documentation that had been preserved regarding the plantation's operations and the events of 1857. Descendants of enslaved families presented evidence that their ancestors had maintained oral traditions regarding the burial sites and resistance activities, and they argued for the right to have these sites properly preserved and commemorated. Property developers countered that insufficient evidence existed to establish the historical significance of specific locations on the property. During the course of these legal proceedings, additional witnesses came forward with accounts that had been preserved in their families regarding encounters with the mysterious individual who had been associated with the property since the 1850s. These accounts extended the timeline of reported sightings into the 1960s and provided detailed descriptions of conversations and interactions that suggested ongoing activities connected to the historical events at the plantation. The most compelling testimony was provided by James Morrison, a man who had worked as a surveyor in the area during the 1950s, and who reported multiple encounters with someone who demonstrated extensive knowledge of property boundaries, underground features, and historical events. Morrison testified that this individual had provided accurate information about the locations of burial sites and structural remains that had not been documented in official surveys, and that he had warned Morrison away from certain areas where subsequent investigation revealed unstable ground conditions. Morrison's testimony included detailed descriptions of conversations in which the individual had displayed knowledge of specific families, dates, and events from the antebellum period that could not have been acquired through normal historical research or education. The individual had apparently possessed information about property ownership, family relationships, and business transactions that was later confirmed through archival research, but that was not available in published sources or commonly known among local residents. The legal proceedings were resolved in 1976 through a settlement that established a historical preserve covering approximately 50 acres of the original plantation site. The preserve included the documented burial sites and structural remains, and access was limited to approved researchers and descendants of families who could demonstrate historical connections to the property. Development was permitted on the remainder of the land, but with restrictions designed to protect any additional historical sites that might be discovered during construction. The historical preserve operated under the supervision of the Georgia Historical Society until 1984, when budget constraints forced a reduction in staffing and maintenance activities. During this period, several incidents occurred that suggested ongoing unauthorized activities on the property, including the discovery of recently disturbed earth at burial sites and evidence that someone had been conducting systematic searches of areas that had not been previously excavated by official investigators. Security measures were implemented to prevent unauthorized access to the preserve, but these measures proved ineffective against someone who appeared to possess intimate knowledge of the property and the ability to move through the area without detection. Motion sensors and surveillance cameras installed in 1985 recorded multiple instances of unauthorized presence on the property, but the recording showed only shadowy figures moving through heavily forested areas and provided insufficient detail for identification. The final documented sighting occurred in 1989, when a graduate student conducting research on the property for a dissertation on antebellum plantation agriculture reported a prolonged encounter with someone who provided detailed information about the historical significance of specific locations on the site. The student, Rebecca Martinez, described a conversation that lasted several hours and included information about the resistance network, the events of 1857, and the ongoing efforts to preserve and protect historical evidence. Martinez reported that the individual appeared to be elderly, but moved with surprising agility and demonstrated familiarity with every aspect of the property's terrain and history. The conversation included references to documents and evidence that had not been uncovered by previous researchers, and the individual provided specific directions to locations where additional material could be found. When Martinez attempted to follow up on this information, she discovered several items that proved to be authentic historical artifacts from the antebellum period. The individual also provided Martinez with what appeared to be a personal account of the events of 1857, including details about the planning and execution of the fires and the reasons why these actions had been necessary to prevent the continued suppression of information about resistance activities and the violent treatment of people who had attempted to escape or assist others in escaping from slavery. According to Martinez's report, the individual claimed to have been personally present during the events of 1857 and to have continued working to preserve and protect historical evidence related to the resistance network and its participants. The individual expressed satisfaction that official recognition had finally been given to the historical significance of the site, but also indicated that additional work remained to be done to ensure that the full story of what had occurred would be preserved and understood by future generations. Martinez attempted to arrange follow-up meetings with the individual, but these efforts were unsuccessful despite her continued presence on the property for several additional weeks. She left written messages and supplies at locations where she believed they might be found, but received no further contact despite clear evidence that her messages had been discovered and her supplies had been taken. The Martinez encounter was the last reliably documented sighting of the mysterious individual associated with the former Whitmore plantation site. Subsequent researchers and visitors to the historical preserve reported occasional signs of unauthorized presence, but no further direct contact was established. The preserve continued to operate on a limited basis until 1997, when it was transferred to the National Park Service as part of a program to preserve sites related to slavery and resistance activities. Under federal management, the preserve received increased resources for research and interpretation, and systematic archaeological investigation was conducted to document the full extent of the burial sites and structural remains. This work revealed additional evidence of the complex network of resistance activities that had operated in the area, but it also confirmed that many questions about specific events and individuals would likely remain unanswered due to the deliberate destruction and concealment of evidence that had occurred during the antebellum period. The archaeological work also revealed that someone had been conducting careful maintenance and protection of the historical sites over an extended period, well beyond what could be explained by official preservation efforts. Burial sites showed evidence of ongoing care and respect. Structural remains had been stabilized to prevent further deterioration, and artifacts had been preserved in conditions that prevented damage from weather and natural decay. Most significantly, the archaeological team discovered evidence that suggested systematic documentation of the site's history had been conducted by someone with extensive knowledge of historical research methods and preservation techniques. Hidden caches contained carefully preserved documents, artifacts, and photographic records that documented changes to the site over a period of more than a century, and provided information about visitors, researchers, and activities that had occurred there. The documentation revealed the extent of the efforts that had been made to preserve evidence related to the resistance network, and to ensure that information about the violent suppression of resistance activities would be available for future researchers and historians. The materials included detailed maps, genealogical records, and personal accounts that provided a comprehensive picture of plantation operations and resistance activities that had not been available through conventional historical sources. The federal investigation concluded that the preservation activities had been conducted by someone with exceptional knowledge of historical research, archaeology, and conservation techniques, combined with intimate familiarity with the specific history of the site and access to sources of information that were not available through normal channels. The level of expertise and the consistency of the preservation efforts suggested work that had been conducted over decades by someone with extraordinary commitment to ensuring that the historical record would be preserved despite official efforts to conceal or destroy evidence. Today, the former Whitmore Plantations site operates as the Elias Benjamin Cartwright Historical Preserve, named in recognition of the individual whose actions in 1857 brought attention to the resistance activities and violent suppression that had characterized plantation operations in antebellum Georgia. The preserve serves as both a memorial to the individuals who lost their lives while participating in resistance activities, and a research center for scholars studying slavery, resistance, and the complexities of historical documentation. Visitors to the preserve can view the documented burial sites, explore reconstructed portions of the resistance network routes, and examine artifacts and documents that provide insight into both the daily life of enslaved individuals and their efforts to resist the conditions of their enslavement. Educational programs focus on the sophisticated nature of resistance activities and the courage required to participate in networks that provided assistance to individuals seeking freedom. The preserve also serves as a reminder of the ongoing challenges involved in historical research when official records have been deliberately destroyed or concealed, and when oral traditions provide the primary sources of information about significant events and individuals. The case of Elias and the events of 1857 illustrate both the importance of resistance activities in the antebellum South and the difficulties faced by historians attempting to document and understand these activities based on fragmentary and often deliberately obscured evidence. Recent research conducted at the preserve has focused on tracing connections between the Central Georgia Resistance Network and similar activities in other regions, using the documents and evidence preserved at the site to identify patterns and relationships that extend across broader geographical areas. This work has revealed that the resistance activities documented at the former Whitmore Plantation were part of a much larger network that operated throughout the southeastern United States and included sophisticated systems for communication, supply, and coordination between widely separated locations. The research has also confirmed that the preservation and protection of historical evidence at the site continued well into the 20th century, conducted by someone who possessed not only intimate knowledge of the specific events that had occurred there, but also understanding of the broader historical significance of these events and their connections to resistance activities in other locations and time periods. Whether this individual was actually Elias, who would have been well over 100 years old by the time of the most recent documented sightings, or whether the preservation activities were conducted by descendants or associates who had inherited both knowledge and responsibility for maintaining the site, remains a matter of speculation among researchers and historians who study the preserve and its history. What seems certain is that the events of 1857 at the Whitmore Plantation represented not an isolated incident of individual violence, but rather a carefully planned action that was part of a sustained campaign of resistance against the institution of slavery and the violence used to maintain it. The fires that destroyed plantation buildings and records were designed to eliminate evidence of the systematic suppression of resistance activities and to disrupt the operations of individuals who had participated in that suppression. The story of Elias and the preservation of evidence related to his actions and their historical context serves as a reminder of the complexity of resistance to slavery and the sophisticated nature of the networks that provided support for these activities. It also illustrates the challenges faced by individuals and communities seeking to preserve historical memory when official institutions have attempted to suppress or distort the historical record. The former Whitmore Plantation site continues to reveal new information about resistance activities and their historical significance as research techniques improve and as additional sources of information become available. The preserve serves not only as a memorial to individuals who sacrificed their lives in the struggle against slavery, but also as a research facility that contributes to ongoing efforts to understand and document the full complexity of resistance activities during the antebellum period. The mystery of who conducted the systematic preservation of evidence at the site for more than a century may never be fully resolved, but the results of those efforts have provided historians with unprecedented access to information about plantation operations, resistance activities, and the violent suppression of individuals who challenged the institution of slavery. This information has fundamentally changed understanding of the sophistication and extent of resistance networks in the antebellum South, and has provided evidence of the courage and determination of individuals who risked everything to challenge an institution that they understood to be morally wrong and historically unsustainable. The legacy of Elias and the events of 1857 continues to resonate in ongoing discussions about historical memory, resistance to oppression, and the responsibility of historians to document and preserve evidence of both officially sanctioned violence and the efforts of individuals and communities to resist that violence. The former Whitmore Plantation site stands as testimony to the power of systematic resistance and to the importance of preserving historical evidence even when official institutions attempt to suppress or destroy that evidence. And perhaps, in the shadows of the towering pines that now cover much of the former plantation site, the work of documentation and preservation continues, conducted by individuals who understand that historical memory requires constant vigilance and that the stories of resistance and courage must be preserved for future generations who will face their own challenges in the ongoing struggle for justice and human dignity.